While I was out in the garden tending to my plants, I didn't expect any visitors. It was my favorite part of the day, getting my hands dirty, feeling the sun on my skin, and just enjoying the peace. But then out of nowhere, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. I turned around, and there he was, my grandson, Jack, standing with that big, playful grin he always had. "Grandma," he called out, his voice warm and full of energy. I couldn't help but smile. "Jack, what are you doing here?" I asked, brushing off the dirt from my hands. He came closer and gave me a big, unexpected hug. It caught me off guard, but I hugged him back, feeling his strong arms wrapped around me. Jack was 24 now, and it amazed me how quickly he'd grown into this tall, handsome man. "I wanted to surprise you," he said, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes. "I know how much you love this garden, and I thought I'd come help you out." I laughed softly. Well, I certainly wasn't expecting company, but I won't say no to some help. As he knelt beside me, grabbing a small shovel, there was something in the way he moved. His youthful energy filled the air, and for a moment, the garden felt alive in a different way. We started working side by side, chatting about his work, his friends, and life in general. But then, as we worked, something changed. Jack reached for a pot, his arm brushing against mine, and a shiver raced through me. That seemingly innocent touch lingered just a heartbeat too long, sending a wave of electricity coursing through my veins. The sensation was overwhelming, as if the very air between us was charged with an unspoken connection. Trying to focus on the task at hand, I found it impossible to ignore how close he was. Then, as he leaned in to pull a weed, his face came tantalizingly close to mine. I felt his warm breath against my cheek, and the space between us seemed to crackle with a newfound intimacy. Our eyes met, and in his gaze was a depth of emotion that made my heart race with excitement and uncertainty. "Are you okay, Grandma?" he asked softly, his voice tender yet laced with an intensity I hadn't heard before. His eyes searched mine with a look that made my breath hitch. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice faltering as I tried to maintain my composure. I forced a smile, but the atmosphere between us had shifted dramatically. Every time I glanced his way, I caught him looking at me with a gaze that stirred a fluttering desire in my chest. As we continued, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Jack's usual playful demeanor was replaced by something more profound, more charged. When he stood up to stretch, he brushed his hands against his shirt, revealing a hint of his toned abdomen. My gaze was drawn to the way his shirt clung to him, my heart pounding in sync with the heat that enveloped us. "You know, Grandma," Jack said, his voice dropping to a hushed, intimate tone, "I've always thought you were the most beautiful woman I've ever known." His words were a caress more than just a compliment. They were a declaration that left me breathless. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his hands moving to gently pull me into his embrace. His fingers traced a path down my arm, sending sparks of sensation wherever they touched. I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, and the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. With a tender, almost reverent touch, he brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered, grazing my cheek, and I felt a wave of longing that was both exhilarating and terrifying. As if sensing my inner turmoil, he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was gentle, exploratory, a question rather than a statement. My heart raced as I responded, my lips meeting his, with a fervor I hadn't anticipated. The kiss deepened, growing more passionate, as if we were both discovering a hidden part of ourselves. His hands roamed to my waist, pulling me closer, his touch igniting a fire within me that I couldn't ignore. In the midst of our kiss, Jack's hands slowly began to undo the buttons of my blouse, each movement deliberate and full of unspoken promises. I felt a rush of vulnerability mixed with exhilaration as my clothing fell away, leaving me feeling both exposed and incredibly alive. We pulled back for a moment, our breaths mingling, our eyes locked in a gaze that spoke volumes. "You mean so much to me," Jack whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I need you to know how deeply I feel about you." My heart ached with the intensity of the moment. I reached up, my fingers tracing his jawline as I leaned in for another kiss. This one filled with the depth of everything unsaid between us. The world outside ceased to exist as we lost ourselves in each other, exploring the newfound connection that had ignited between us. Finally, when we broke apart, our faces flushed and our hearts racing, Jack gave me a soft, knowing smile. "I'll go make us some tea," he said, his voice still carrying the weight of our shared moment. I watched him walk away, feeling both exhilarated and uncertain. The warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, and I knew that something profound and transformative had shifted between us. As he walked away, I stood there, watching him go, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over me. I wasn't sure what to think, what to feel. This was my grandson, and yet there was a new dynamic between us that I couldn't deny. When I eventually went inside, Jack was already in the kitchen, 2 cups of tea waiting on the table. He smiled at me when I walked in, that same playful grin from earlier, as if nothing had changed. But I knew, deep down, that things had shifted. As we sat together, sipping our tea in comfortable silence, I couldn't help but wonder where this new tension would lead us, and whether I was ready to face it. As we sat there sipping our tea, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with everything left unsaid. I kept my gaze fixed on the table, stirring my tea aimlessly, trying to make sense of the strange feelings swirling inside me. Jack, sitting across from me, seemed relaxed, too relaxed, given everything that had just happened. His eyes lingered on me, and I could feel his attention like a warm pressure on my skin. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You seem different today. Are you sure you're all right?" I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. There was concern in his eyes, but also something more, something that made my pulse quicken. I wasn't used to feeling this way, especially around Jack. But I couldn't deny the spark between us, the tension that had been building ever since we'd started working in the garden. "I'm fine, Jack," I said quietly, forcing a smile. "It's just been a long day, that's all." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." I hesitated, feeling the weight of his words. There was an openness in his tone, an invitation that felt both comforting and dangerous at the same time. Part of me wanted to brush it all aside, to pretend everything was normal. But another part of me, the part that had felt that electric spark earlier, wanted to know where this was going. "I know, Jack," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But some things are harder to talk about." He didn't say anything for a moment, just studied me with those intense eyes of his. Then, without warning, he stood up and moved around the table. I felt my breath hitch as he came to stand beside me, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "Maybe we don't have to talk," he said quietly, his hand reaching out to gently touch my shoulder. I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. His touch was soft, but there was an underlying intensity in the way his fingers grazed my skin. I should have pulled away. I knew I should have. But instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, drawn to the warmth and the strange comfort it brought. "Jack, this is..." I started, but my words trailed off as he leaned down, his lips brushing against my forehead in the softest of kisses. "It's okay, Grandma," he whispered, his lips lingering just a moment longer before pulling back. "I'm not going anywhere." There was a tenderness in his voice that made my chest tighten. He wasn't rushing anything, wasn't pushing. He was just there, with me, waiting. And as much as I tried to fight it, I couldn't deny the pull between us. I felt safe with Jack, but it was more than that now. There was something growing between us, something that went beyond the boundaries we were supposed to have. "Jack, I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. But before I could finish, his hand gently cupped my cheek, and he tilted my face up to meet his eyes. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "Just let me be here with you." My heart raced as I looked into his eyes, the sincerity in them, both comforting and terrifying. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of the emotions surging through me. But in that moment, with his hand on my cheek and his eyes holding mine, I didn't want to pull away. Slowly, he leaned in again, this time pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. It was gentle, careful, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his lips against my skin, and for a moment, everything else faded away. When he pulled back, I opened my eyes and found him watching me, his expression tender. "I just want to take care of you," he said softly. "That's all." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. This was all so new, so unexpected. But there was a part of me that craved the connection we were forging, even if it scared me. "Jack," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He smiled softly, brushing a stray hair behind my ear. "It's okay," he reassured me. "We don't have to figure it all out right now." And in that moment, I believed him. Maybe we didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe it was okay to just be here together and let things unfold at their own pace. We sat in silence for a while longer, the tension between us still there, but softer now, more manageable. Jack didn't push for anything more, and for that I was grateful. He was patient, giving me the space I needed to process everything. Eventually, he stood up and stretched, his usual playful grin returning. "All right, Grandma," he said with a wink. "How about I make us some dinner?" I laughed softly, the sound easing some of the weight I'd been carrying. "That sounds like a great idea," I replied, feeling a little more like myself again. As he headed to the kitchen, I sat back in my chair, letting out a long breath. I didn't know what was going to happen between us, but for now, I was content to just take things one step at a time. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, we'd figure it out together.